I'm going to start us off today um, with a traditional greeting. So, um, in our language, Skarude, we would say Chwant, Askanaha, Gatha Dequidia, Disna Waknene, Skarude, Equahewet Gayadakra, Igisa Seta Direchaks, Disna Waganaharate Hat Twet Equahewe, Disna Twet Equa, Yaguatnake. So I just wanted to begin by offering a traditional greeting, checking in, words of sharing about peace between each other. Mentioned my Ungwahoa name or my Ekwahewa name, Tekwadia, and the fact that my home is at the Tuscarora Nation. And of course mention my clan and greetings to everyone, in particular the title holders. I see a new round of title holders were just put up by this society, which is exciting always, I guess for next year. So greetings to all the title holders that are listening today. So the name of our presentation, which Dr. Landis primarily came from Dr. Landis, I thought was really good. Haudenosaunee Plantways, past and present. And so I'm going to begin a little bit just describing some ideas and thoughts from my perspective in my time working with Haudenosaunee knowledge holders in our communities. Actually, ever since I was a kid. And so I was born nearby in Lewiston, New York, and raised my entire life on the Tuscarora Nation, which is in northwestern New York, up near Niagara Falls. And plants, of course, were a big part of my upbringing, a big part of my life. The most important plant I had a responsibility for growing up was any dead firewood that came in from our tree plants, from our relatives in the forest. And so I spent many years just stacking, cutting, and splitting wood. That was probably my first one of my first introductions and responsibilities around plants. But there was another special one to me, and of course I love the fact that you guys share plant pictures. I would have just joined to sit in and watch everyone guess on what plants are. Of course, this is a plant that in Tuscarora language, we call it Nea Gwetdichuksui, and it talks about its medicine being actually red, which is our word for blood. And so this is a picture from a few years ago back home. And I just included it because I guess the first time I began thinking about Haudenosaunee Plantways was from one of our pine tree chiefs. And I just want to recognize him. He's now passed on. He held the title of Pine Tree Chief for the White Bears at Tuscarora. His name was Edison Mount Pleasant Gehet. And he's no longer with us, but he introduced me to this plant when I was, I think, in about third grade, and he actually was able to pick some out on his medicine walks, and gave me a small root of this plant in the fall time, and instructed me to go plant it near my house because he sort of knew where I grew up and where I lived. And I guess this began my journey in sitting down and listening to plant knowledge holders in Haudenosaunee communities. And it's a pretty tall order, I think, to go through a very comprehensive coverage of Haudenosaunee spiritual connections to our plant relatives, to our responsibilities to those relatives. And so we're not going to be able to accomplish that together here tonight, right? That takes a lifetime of learning, of sitting down with folks in community, developing relationships, building trust, until we find our path among these plants and our responsibility to the plants. But I'd like to begin by sort of sharing one word that comes up in our conversations, in the conversations I've been part of. You often hear the term in Haudenosaunee country, duties and responsibilities. I used to hear all the old chiefs, some of them no longer with us, and clan mothers and faith keepers talk about our duties and responsibilities. More modern interpretation of that, I think I've heard many of our leadership talk about protocols and procedures. And so I just want to share in the beginning, really, to talk about the notion that our thinking around plants comes from creation, right? And when we think about where do we begin in talking about plants, we always begin with creation. It could be law, it could be science, it could be politics, it could be our lineage, but we always go back to this event that happened here on Turtle Island, where a woman fell from a world that existed above us, and that world was filled with plants. And some of you have explored this Haudenosaunee creation story, probably some of you in great depth, and can recognize the fact that there was a world in the sky that was filled with plants, whose image has now been sort of transported down to Turtle Island. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but in the hand of this woman falling from a hole in the sky, she's bringing with her the seeds and the roots and the twigs and the gifts of the plant world from Sky World. And so in thinking about plants, that is our first protocol, is to remember that they are a gift and a product and are provided through creation. Plenty of Haudenosaunee scientists and leaders have talked about our responsibility to develop positive and healthy relationships with plants. I think you could see that in our communities today, whether it's our families who are growing our old types of corn or beans or squash, plants that have been, that lend themselves to domestication and become part of our seasonal cycle of ceremonies, but also plants that are still wild and never really let themselves become domesticated by human beings here on Turtle Island. And so I really like the phrase, tending gardens, both cultivated and wild, right? And this is how we think about our original instructions that come from creation, is to have a healthy and positive relationship with plants. It's probably something I know typically they're not, that kind of relationship isn't talked about in Western science, but I'm sharing with you today what we've been told is our responsibility. We have a number of protocols in terms of gathering plants. You all probably have gathered plants before, whether it's for propagation, whether you're picking seed for a seed bank, whether you're transporting and replanting rhizomes or cuttings from plants. And so we have this very specific set of rules about how this healthy and positive relationship is expressed in our duties and our protocols to the plant. We talk about them as our relatives, our plant relatives, we talk about our responsibility to have a reciprocal relationship, right? And so you'll often see, at least in Haudenosaunee country, um, folks laying down and offering a gift of some kind to the plant for its for providing its medicine or providing its food or providing its bark for our communities. We also, just as I began this talk, find it very critical to introduce ourselves. And one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about is the language, the Haudenosaunee language of plants today. And we're just going to touch on a little bit of that in terms of our intentions, right? This is something we talk about in classes here at ESF on traditional knowledge. And that is, what is our intent? What is our intent when we walk into the woods, when we decide to pick berries, when it is time to gather roots in the fall? We have to be very clear about our intentions. And I think that's an important aspect for all of, traditional ecological knowledge and scientific ecological knowledge systems. We also often let the plant know who is going to use it. I often in my travels make sure to include sometimes generalized acknowledgement of the fact that my family will be eating this plant. And quite often I will ask the name of the person that I'm gathering the plant for, right? Because this is all done in our language. And that's the interesting thing about Haudenosaunee Plantways is that we've been instructed and we've been told that plants only recognize their Haudenosaunee names for themselves. And likewise, the plant only recognizes our Haudenosaunee name for ourselves as human beings. And so it's important, part of our work is to talk about language revitalization as part of Haudenosaunee Plantways, right? And so you often see this blending of both social science and the physical sciences together in thinking about restoring Haudenosaunee plant relationships. It's important because every plant does have a name. We, unfortunately, in Haudenosaunee country, because of the impact of colonization, in particular, the impact of boarding schools that my grandmother went to, that many of my ancestors were forcibly removed to, that we've lost a lot of those plant names. We still have some though, and it's been part of my journey to learn them. And so when we walk in the woods together, it's important to use those names because that's the name the plant recognizes. And I'm not going to do a deep dive here into Iroquois and linguistics, but the chart at the bottom of this slide actually is a really nice breakdown provided by Dr. Percy Abrams, an Onondaga linguist, about how these verbs, the relationships that plants have with their family members, right, with their cousins, perhaps between Virginia waterleaf and broadleaf waterleaf, those relationships that are encoded in our Haudenosaunee languages are broken down here. We can talk about who the plant is. We can talk about how it behaves. We can talk about the situation that we find the plant in. And we can even modify these verbs that are found in our plant names to put a particular aspect or tense, if you will, to place it in a particular time in our history. One example of that is this plant, which you probably are all familiar with. It's a small graphic at the top right here. suppose people could throw it in the chat here if you know the name of this plant. When I was growing up, you know, again, Edison was one of my teachers and said, this is Skitnoxa wahyux. Skitnoxa wahyux. Yes, perfect, James. Fault Solomon seal. That is a common plant at Tuscarora. And I knew that this first part of the plant name, Skitnoxa, was fox, because as a pre-language immersion program learner back in the late 70s and early 80s, I was being taught nouns, and I was being taught to memorize nouns, and Skitnoxa was one of them. And I always knew that that meant fox. And so I went through life thinking, well, that's the fox plant, Skitnoxa wahyux. It wasn't until people began to illuminate or shine a light on this notion of traditional ecological knowledge that I realized that what was being described here in Tuscarora was a relationship between an animal and a plant. And that relationship is describing the fact that the fox is habitually eating the berries of Fault Solomon seal. And I like to include this for all of you, for all of my fellow plant nerds that are out there. That's what my kids call me. Dad's just a plant nerd, because, you know, a challenge all of us to think about the time, the concentration, perhaps even the spirituality that's involved in naming a plant based on these relationships, right? And so today we do not see typically any scientific literature about the relationship between this mammal and this particular plant, Fault Solomon seal. There's a lot we could dive into here, namely one interesting idea that students in our own communities have had is that, well, you know, we named fox as an animal that skin was bad. And perhaps this fox is medicating itself with the berries of Fault Solomon seal. And so we continue to talk about this in our language immersion programs. We continue to try to understand, in this case, a Tuscarora way of thinking about the world and thinking about plants, right? Most of us have been educated in the world of thinking about Latin or English as it comes to plants. And that's what we're bound by, essentially, right? Those possibilities are contained within that worldview of English and Latin when we talk about plants. The worldview becomes very different when we begin to use the language of this place, the language of the Finger Lakes, right? When you think about that, you know, there is a language of the Finger Lakes, Onondaga, and that's the Seneca language. Guayuque, that's the Cayuga language. Gayachisnaquatniyu, that's the Onondaga language. These are languages of the Finger Lakes. English and Latin, you know, they come from somewhere else. Our effort to focus on our relationship with plants is often part of a broader spectrum. And so as you just saw, thinking about mammals, but also thinking about fish and thinking about water and thinking about climate and atmosphere, these are all part of our cultural lifeways, right? These are part of a seasonal cycle of relationships with plants, captured here in what we would call the Haudenosaunee spiritual cycle of ceremonies, in fact. And so we're somewhere right in here. We just finished up maple, one of our most important plants. And we often, referred to sugar maple as the leader of our trees in the woods. And many of us now are really focusing in on seeds. We're thinking about what seeds we're getting ready. We're cleaning and gleaning our seeds together in our homes and getting ready to plant. All of this seasonal cycle of ceremonies has so many plant actors, if you will, in this beautiful display of the year, right? Of the lunar calendar that we go by to establish these ceremonies. And so folks often will say, well, what do the Haudenosaunee think about this? What's the climate adaptation plan for Haudenosaunee communities? What is the plant restoration that is going on in Haudenosaunee communities? And inevitably, when you talk to some of the traditional people in our communities, this is what they point back to. This is our self-determination. This is our adaptation plan. And this is our restoration plan, all rolled up into one. Many of you probably have seen this map. And so thinking about where this spiritual cycle of ceremonies takes place, we have to recognize that they take place in a small, very small fragment of our former territories, right? Our former land base. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Rick Hill, up in Grand River, actually sat down one day and sort of thought about, it's not a very Haudenosaunee concept to talk about land ownership, but if we were to talk about it in pure simple terms of land loss, he has calculated we're talking about a 99.9% plus, a greater than 99.9% loss of land as nations, right, as confederacies. And so we're living on small postage size, stamp sized reservations within our former territories. This, of course, has been at the heart of many land rights and land claim work that's going on in our communities. And we have to recognize that effort to regain access and caretaking of our traditional territories, a lot of that is because of plants. We currently have reservations that do not have certain plant species. And we're not going to get into the politics of harvesting plants off of our reservation today. That we'll save that for another day. But it should be known that what we are thinking about is our traditional territories, using our traditional place names in terms of access, right? This is the foundation, if you will, of moving towards the caretaking of place and the caretaking of plants. The cultural modifications of the landscape that are required to produce berries or to produce certain tree species that normally would not be there without our healthy and positive relationship with plants. And of course, again, at the center of this is our original instructions, our lifeways that say, here's what you do when this moon comes out, right? And all of that is based on our ability to access the lands and waters of our ancestors and to be able to take care of those places within inside that access, right? This model of access and tenure are often at the center of a concept that many of our communities have been promoting and it has often been termed resurgence, right? Indigenous resurgence. And I just love the way one author in Canada talks about Indigenous resurgence. She says, it's having the courage and imagination to envision life beyond the state. And I think as fellow plant enthusiasts, I think many of you are thinking about that all the time, in fact, to imagine and to envision life beyond the state. And you probably could even insert plant life beyond the state, right? Every time we look at whether it's over browsing by deer in our forests, or whether we look at habitat destruction or development, we think about what it could be like in those lands for plants, right? Beyond the state, the current state. This resurgence, and I just want to provide some quick examples here before we get to Dr. Landis's exploration of some of the history behind these traditional lifeways. The primary example I have actually comes from our leadership who traveled to the United Nations in 1974, the year I was born. They traveled on their own Haudenosaunee passports, and they actually brought all of these teachings and knowledge of plants with them to Geneva, Switzerland. And they sat down in front of the United Nations and they said, and they delivered this message of resurgence, right? To envision life beyond the state. They produced a seminal document that we use here at ESF all the time. It's called the Basic Call to Consciousness. If you have not seen this document, this book that was published as a result of their trip to the United Nations, I encourage you to do that, because eventually it becomes the basis 40, 50 years later for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in this particular article, what we're attempting to just gloss over tonight together is this distinctive spiritual relationship with these places. I'm not a big fan of the term "and other resources" that's used in here. I think Haudenosaunee people would say "and other relatives" to uphold the responsibility to future generations in this regard. And so this message is not new. This approach, this worldview, this epistemology that we're talking about in terms of what's possible between humans and plants was captured at that time. And it came at a time of environmental crisis and destruction, and a call really on the world to think about those healthy relationships with our plant relatives among the rest of the natural world. So what are we doing about resurgence? I just want to provide a few examples to folks of work that the center is doing. Some of you on this call, I'm scrolling through the names earlier, have been part of this effort as well. Our first and primary effort has been to work within our communities with our youth in our communities. And so this understanding our responsibilities to our plant relatives has been a big part of our Native Earth program, right? In which we bring students to places like the Adirondacks to experience the biota and systems that they have never maybe experienced before within a reservation community, right? Or within perhaps even an urban community. This is the first time students are able to pick sweetgrass. This is a photo from a few years ago. And we were able to rely on our Kanien'kehá:ka, our Mohawk brothers and sisters to guide us in these teachings about plants, to talk about using the name for the plants, to talk about using our own Ongwehoan names when we're around those plants. And this has actually led to a few other interesting projects the center has been working on. Indigenous bioblitzes. We have been asked by communities, Haudenosaunee communities, to do an inventory, to go into a place within their traditional territory. Quite often, these places are places that are being considered for the rematriation or the return of land to nations and communities. And oftentimes they are done within the community itself to understand what kind of plant relatives exist on the reservation or in places of interest the community has been looking at and trying to rebuild relationships with. These are some pictures from Tonawanda, one of the most impressive bioblitzes that Dr. Landis and I have been part of, and a wonderful demonstration of how an intact way of thinking about plants manifests itself on the land when we see the biodiversity on reservation communities. And we notice it quite often, the lack of invasive species. We notice not far down this same body of water, you just see massive amounts of Japanese knotweed and Phragmites that curiously does not exist in many of our communities. And some of our elders will say, well, that's the result of our thinking. That's the result of these protocols that we have around plants. Finally, something that has emerged out of inventorying places for culturally significant plants, something that has emerged from bringing kids to harvest sweetgrass in the Adirondacks, is something we're considering a cultural provisioning network, right? And so we have students here at ESF who have been using lots of different data sets to identify places where a community has a particular need for a plant and might not be able to locate it. A plant that's needed for medicine, for healing, a plant sometimes that's needed actually for ceremonies within the community and cannot be found on or near the reservation. And quite often this is done at many different scales, of course. This is a map actually showing some wild ginger. It's sort of like a suitability index, if you will, a gradient of possible locations for wild ginger in a state forest, but also within walking distance of a trail, right? And thinking about access, right? How does the community access these places? Are there places for elders to be able to park and walk in and share teachings with other members of the community? And we're going to circle back to this a little bit later, but I also wanted to share, in thinking about this data set, we actually met with the DEC and kind of began to explain why Haudenosaunee people have this sincere interest in reestablishing relationships with our plant relatives all across the state. And it was an elder from Onondaga who was describing a very old pathway that her family used to gather plant medicines, and that over time, that parcel of land became subdivided and eventually was posted as private land. And she said, and here I am out there with my basket and wearing my traditional skirt, and I'm trying to hop over a barbed wire fence to go and access these plants for my community. And the picture she painted was sort of comical, I guess, to the folks in the room. And several people sort of laughed, and they looked at her and with like sort of quizzical look on their face, like, for one, why are you wearing a skirt, which is a whole nother discussion. But they sort of thought, well, this is an act of trespass in our way of thinking. And she looked back at them and she said, I didn't cross the fence crossed our path. And it's the same message that we see in discussions of international borders, places where shared lands meet each other. And I just wanted to share, I thought that was a really interesting perspective, is that, you know, I don't cross the fence crossed our path at some point. And it's this collective pronoun of our, you know, when you use it in the language, that makes it very special. One of those plants, of course, at Onondaga that I've been learning about a lot is our many different hickory relatives for a game and a ceremony that we call Yutnaruhas in Skaruda. And if some of you know this as hickory or as the game of lacrosse, and learning about how we might be able to find ideal logs for our lacrosse stick makers in our community. And this one is really special to me because I grew up at Tuscarora making lacrosse sticks for most of my youth. This is where I began the journey in thinking about plant protocols, is when we began to shape these trees into a game that our men play for the creator, in fact. Again, going back to creation, right? These plants were created during creation, and they have a specific role to fulfill. And our job is to make sure that plants can fulfill their own duties and their own responsibilities. The last slide I have is just a sort of an interesting one that sort of culminates in a lot of different things going on here. I always grew up hearing about the potato clan. And it wasn't until some research by Dr. Landis, and in some ways, really the beginnings of a cultural provisioning network, to understand a little bit more about this plant, and to have my kids go out to the shore of the Oswego River and be able to gather this tuber. This tuber that was so important to Haudenosaunee people that at one time, the Onondaga actually had this as a clan. It's probably one of our only plant clans, you might say, in Haudenosaunee territory. And it's just been a wonderful experience for me and my family to reestablish and become reacquainted with this particular plant. Apios americana. I'm going to turn this over to Catherine now, who can sort of build on this idea of looking at history and using it as a building block for reestablishing Haudenosaunee plantways.
All right, I'll share my screen here. All right, are we good? Everybody see that? Yep. Okay, well, thank you, Neil. That was great. And good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here on this cold, rainy night. So I'm going to kind of pick up where Neil left off and to offer some thoughts about this topic of Haudenosaunee plantways from a historical ecology perspective. So I'm a person of European descent, Euro-American heritage. So I look at this topic from an ally scholar's perspective and as a plant ecologist and historical ecologist. So if you're not familiar with historical ecology, basically we pull in information from various sources and disciplines to trace patterns of ecosystem change over time. And this is my kind of thesis statement here, that the Haudenosaunee are and were historically a forest adapted culture with great facility and use of and knowledge about plants. So I'm going to look at these two questions in particular. How did people use plants, and how did they care for land, what we might call land management? But the Haudenosaunee don't really use that term. They tend to use words like tending and caring, as Neil mentioned. And then Neil and I both are going to talk a little bit about things you can do if you're interested. So I want to start with this image. I was inspired to put this together because of a story I heard from Oren Lyons, who some of you may know, who's an Onondaga faith keeper. He once said he could always find the Onondaga Nation when he flew over the Syracuse area. So there's Syracuse there, Onondaga Lake, because it was the largest block of contiguous forest that he could see out of the plane window. So I don't know if anyone, I don't know how well this is showing up on your screen, but you can probably guess what the area I'm talking about. In case you can't, there it is. So for me, this alone says volumes about the appreciation of forest land and the relationship with forest on the part of the Onondaga people. I also, before I get into the questions, I want to just remind ourselves that there's a long Indigenous history in New York State, what we call New York State, going back about 13,000 years when the glaciers melted and people came back, all the way up to the present. So I've put together this timeline here. In the top row, I've just put kind of coarse scale vegetation changes based on pollen record. And then the bottom row there shows some cultural changes. Like I said, people came back to the area, so-called Paleo Indians, about 13,000 years ago. And then by about 5,000 years ago, there were signs of expanded human presence in the archaeological record. And archaeologists think that this is due to plants, due to an expanded suite of species, particularly mass-producing species that were present, things like your hickories and oaks and maybe walnut, other species that not only provided food for people, but food for game animals that became huntable. And then Three Sisters agriculture came quite a bit later. The record for squash in the Finger Lakes is about 3,000 years ago, followed by, and I'm just going to move this, maize, and then corn. And I had to put the date that the Finger Lakes Native Plant Society was founded over here, just to include that on the timeline. But anyway, the point I want to make is that plant science has been indigenous plant science for the vast majority of human history here. So there's been thousands of years of relationship building with plants before Europeans ever arrived. Let's see. So getting into this first question of how people use plants and what kind of plants they use. So I have a friend at Onondaga who, from whom I got this quotation, "Everything we need is right here." And I tried to represent this here in this schematic. And even historians say that the Haudenosaunee were largely self-sufficient in terms of food, in terms of building materials, fuel, medicine, and most of the material, all these materials that you see here came from plants. And people, they had the plant knowledge and also the manual skill to be able to take these materials from plants and to convert them into household items. And we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. So, you know, you could say the forest was pharmacy, it was grocery, it was energy and fuel source, kind of like Home Depot, Wegmans, all rolled into one. And this is a story that kind of illustrates that knowledge and facility. So here we have Moravian missionaries, so from Germany in 1753, they're struggling to build a boat to cross Oneida Lake. So this is in 1753, rivers were highways for travel in the Lake Ontario plain. So to get anywhere, you had to be able to build a boat, often on the spot as here. So we went into the woods to find a tree suitable for a bark canoe. While we were working on our boat, and Oneida came and saw we were very awkward about our work. He at once called two of his friends. They took our work to pieces, and in 2 hours' time, they had finished the boat. We were very glad indeed, as we could doubtless have worked the whole day, and even then with poor success. So if you think about what it would take to build a canoe, the amount of plant knowledge that would go into this, I mean, obviously you would need bark of the right species, ideally gathered at the right time of year. This happens to be July, not a good time to gather bark. You would need ribs and thwarts. You need thread to sew the canoe together, sew the pieces together, some kind of pitch or glue to prevent leakage, and then you need paddles. So this passage to me illustrates the knowledge of plants and also the manual facility to use the materials at hand with no shop, no mill, or some of the advantages that people had later. Here's a similar story, this time related by French Jesuit missionaries coming to Onondaga Lake in 1656. They say the architects of this country build their houses, palaces, ships much more rapidly than those of Europe. And so think of building a canoe in 2 hours. And if we're not lodged there so sumptuously, still one often dwells there in greater comfort and gladness. So people could very quickly use materials at hand to create a shelter that kept them warm and dry, protected from the elements, comfortable. In this particular case, and that happens to be a longhouse constructed by Neil at the State Fairgrounds, if you ever go to the State Fair. But again, a number of plants would be involved here. The bark, shingles, the covering was usually elm or chestnut or whatever was available. The posts, ideally you wanted a rot-resistant wood like cedar or chestnut. And then for the ceiling, they used more flexible woods like ash or hickory. And this is probably just a short list of the different species, different kinds of wood that would go into building structures. Plants, of course, for storage containers like baskets, and many on this, and many in attendance here tonight probably know about black ash baskets. Black ash swamps were apparently much more common in the Finger Lakes than they are today. Many of these areas have been drained or filled for agriculture or other purposes. Elm bark was also used for baskets. There are reports of Native women producing 10, 20 gallon elm vats from elm bark to hold maple sap. So think about that. They'd have to be, first of all, big and watertight, and would have to be to bear a fair amount of weight. So again, the skill that people had to the facility to create materials that they needed for their lives. Of course, plants were used for medicine. Forests, swamps like this cedar swamp were pharmacies. And so nearly every plant you see here in this picture has some kind of medicinal property. I see gold thread, partridge berry, Canada Mayflower, and of course, northern white cedar is really kind of the celebrity medicine, at least from a European perspective. Of course, also known as arbor vitae. This was the tree that, according to most sources, saved the French explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535 when he was stuck for winter in the St. Lawrence River, and his men had serious case of scurvy as well as other infections. The native people of the area brought him teas made of cedar needles, very high in vitamin C, and they said it was a miracle. They were cured not only of the scurvy, but of other infections that they had. So cedar, of course, high in vitamin C, but also antibiotic, antiviral, and immune enhancing, just to provide one example here. Of course, plants were important food. these are just some examples from a book called, I think it's Iroquois Foods by an ethnographer named Waugh. And he actually lists about 75 plants that were eaten by the Haudenosaunee. So here I've just a sample. Neil mentioned hickory, shagbark hickory for the nuts. Also, bitternut hickory was used for an oil, and the oil was not bitter, so I'm told. Milkweed is a very popular plant on the nation to this day. Wild plum was also a favored plant planted around village sites, and plum pits have been found in archaeological sites as well. Most of you probably recognize black cherry, which was not only a food, but also a medicine. Think of black cherry cough syrup. I don't know, maybe some of you have had some form of that. Butternut, very important nut tree. In fact, one Onondaga chief says you can locate former Haudenosaunee settlements by looking for patches of concentrated patches of butternut. And then, of course, berries of all kinds were appreciated, including those in the genus rubus, like your raspberries, blackberries, etc. There's archaeological evidence also that suggests different plant foods. Certainly acorns, which were an important starch source. Think of those thousands of years before maize really became a prominent food source. Nut trees could have provided that starch source. Wild rice used to be quite common on the Seneca River, the Oneida River, even Onondaga Lake. I know that's hard to believe, as well as Lake Ontario, where it is to this day. Nut sedge. So this would be Cyperus esculentus. And in the case of the nut sedge and the wild rice, the evidence for use of these plants is actually based on residues from cooking pots. So a little more subtle. And then those, I believe, are from the Oneida River, so fairly close by. And the purslane was, of course, grows in disturbed area, popular green, very nutritious, and again, berries like this black elderberry here. And I listed a few sources here. If you're interested, there's many, many more plants that have been found in archaeological sites. So to jump to the second question, what do we know about how people cared for the forest, at least in the past? I kind of divided this into active and passive impacts. Certainly fire, and you've probably all heard about Native people using fire to create openings, say for villages or for crops. Of course, when you create these openings, you get successional habitats, and the default vegetation in most of the Haudenosaunee territory would be closed canopy forest. So creating these openings, of course, is really important to kind of diversify your plant resources. Plants, I mentioned the wild plum, which was thought to have been planted along with butternut around village sites. There's also some evidence that plants like chestnut were coppiced. If you think about chestnut, it sprouts really well. And I mentioned that it was used for longhouse posts because of its rot resistance. So a coppice system could produce poles of a nice, small, convenient diameter for construction. And then I have that picture of pawpaw there. Some plants were moved not only within their range, but beyond their range. So there's evidence that pawpaw was brought here by the Haudenosaunee people. So just to give you a couple of examples here of plants that might benefit from these successional habitats. Strawberry, very important fruit to the Haudenosaunee. It's the only berry for which there is a ceremony. So this person, another missionary, describes places where strawberries grow so large and in such abundance, whole plains are covered with them as with a fine scarlet cloth. They are remarkably well flavored. And of course, strawberries, to have the sunlight to produce well, need some kind of disturbance. And there's some indication that the Onondaga word for strawberry is translated as growing where the ground is burned, which makes sense. But there's also, there's some ambiguity about this. It could just mean that it's referring to the color of the strawberry looking like fire, kind of like in the description there. And there you see wild strawberries growing in profusion. This disturbance here was not fire, but this is actually a parking lot along the Lake Ontario shore. But this was just filled with these wild strawberry blossoms. And when I came back to pick them, they were just in that kind of abundance. And of course, the cedar waxwings were also very happy about the berries. But I mentioned pawpaw as an example of a range extension. So there are records for pawpaw from, well, when Persh was here in 1807, he described pawpaw in central New York around along the Oneida River. There's also been seeds found in archaeological sites. And then again, from the Jesuits describe this tree. They don't use the word pawpaw, but they say it came from the country of the cats, which would refer to the Erie over here in Western New York. So kind of thinking about this range extension, I just wanted to show you this map. This is kind of a hypothesized version of possible trade routes in 1500. So this would be pre-European. But what it suggests to me anyway is that there was a lively exchange network. Now here, so this is Jim Bradley. He's an archaeologist, works with Onondaga sites. And he's talking about copper as well as marine shell. But I look at a map like this and say, well, if they moved copper, if marine shell was traded these long distances, plants could be moved too. Plants, ideas, people moved, and they moved great distances. So the range extension of some of these culturally valuable plants is entirely possible. So ways people impacted the forest that were more incidental or passive. So this would be things like the creation of edges around village sites or seed dispersal by travelers. We mentioned the use of bark for longhouses and for all kinds of tools and containers. So, assuming that they were taking large slabs of bark, that would kill trees and open up spaces, create openings, as well as, of course, tree harvest. What we're looking at here is the outline of one of the longest longhouses that I know about. This is about 300 feet long. Again, this is in central New York, an Onondaga longhouse. But a longhouse of this size would take hundreds, even potentially thousands of poles. So you can imagine the impact on local forests of some of the construction, not to mention fuel wood, for cooking and heating. So it's thought that that impact went out about 15 kilometers from a village. Also, communities moved. Again, this is based on the archaeological record. There seemed to be these short distance removals. They would go to a settlement a few miles away, so it wasn't very far. But what that meant was they could go back to these abandoned village sites to have access to those early successional species like berries and nuts, and things like dogbane for cordage or milkweed. So even with this disturbance, I think anyway, that large areas remained forested, and much of that was old growth. And the evidence for this certainly comes from written sources like this passage describing Mohawk River floodplain forests. So the maples, elms, hornbeams astonish you with their height. A European would have trouble imagining the majesty of these ancient trees, which no iron has ever mutilated. But the farmer is little touched by these natural beauties. Fire and axe will soon destroy these centuries old creation. So of course they're describing, what happened when Europeans came in and did major forest clearance and potash production. So we have these written records, and then also the pollen data really do not indicate any kind of major forest clearance until this deforestation that came with European settlement. I also think that there's some suggestion here that indigenous plant science included some form of carbon management, maintaining large areas of forest. I mean, I don't know if there was a word for carbon, but whether they would have recognized that term or not, I do think that that's entirely possible. So Neil and I will both sum up our presentation here. We're going to then close with some suggestions of things people can participate in the work we do if you're interested, and then we'll open it up for questions. So for my section, I discussed the Haudenosaunee as this forest adapted culture. They relied on plants for major aspects of material culture, diet, and more. And they have thousands of years of experience to develop native plant science, technology, and facility in use of plant materials.
Yeah, and to circle back to the loss of access and to the loss of tenure, in that this ongoing relationship of access and tenure, it is coming really as a result of colonization, of language loss, of the dispossession or the theft of indigenous land, much of which was precipitated by things like the Morrill Act that Cornell was involved in, and for the most part on illegal land transactions conducted by the state of New York, some of which are actually being addressed in some ongoing settlements. And to say that, our efforts at resurgence, our efforts at getting back to the spiritual way of life, right, to the spiritual cycle of ceremonies, requires a relationship with plants. You really can't be a Haudenosaunee person without plants. And I don't know if you can say that about being a settler or being part of another a nation, a group of people. And so this access and this caretaking that is we're seeking in the projects we do, whether it's land back or rematriation of land, gets back to that original intent, right? To carry on what we would say is Chwantnayat, and that means like in Tuscarora, and you hear this in Haudenosaunee communities, it's to continue to stir about. And there's an interesting parallel there with sort of stirring the pot, moving things around. That's what we would say is our restoration plan. So, again, I mentioned early on, I know there's a couple of people on the call here today on the Zoom that have been part of our efforts. There's in the lower right a picture of one of our bio blitzes that we did in concert with the Akwesasne Freedom School, on some property in the Adirondacks. We have participated in with groups like the Finger Lakes Land Trust in educating folks about this resurgence, and about tenure and access to our plant relatives. We actually are involved a lot in thinking about institutions like Cornell, or institutions, and for our case, SUNY. Turns out ESF, like Cornell, is one of the largest campuses by land in the East. We have 25,000 acres across Haudenosaunee territory. And so it's not about a land acknowledgement anymore, right? It goes beyond that in thinking about access and tenure to those 25,000 acres, and how that's accomplished, whether it's cultural use agreements or agreements with Indigenous nations. I saw Chrissy's name, Chrissy Boyes from down in the Mundy Wildflower Garden. You know, it's been just a wonderful journey in bringing folks down to the Wildflower Garden to think about how Indigenous communities are involved in the restoration and propagation of culturally significant plants, to know the season that when the seeds are ready, right, from our plant relatives in the woods. Now we're getting ready to gather leeks, but we're also thinking very specifically about when those seeds are ready in the fall time from those plants. The Cultural Provisioning Network, that's one I think of this group a lot. And if there was one way in which you can be involved, is to say, hey, I know where a really healthy patch of wild ginger is growing. And it's in a place where you're able to access and to take care of it, perhaps in bringing some of those rhizomes back to our other places in our traditional territories, like maybe within our reservations itself. So it's just an emerging concept right now to develop a cultural provisioning network, but we'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas about how, what are some of the best practices around establishing that kind of network. And finally, I know David, who we now call the Fen Man, who's on our call here, and Alex Petsky, and just been wonderful to work with folks like yourselves on this call who can get out into the field on these Indigenous bioblitzes and say, yeah, this is a Virginia waterleaf. This is not the broadleaf waterleaf. And it begins a really nice journey for our communities to reestablish connection and relationship. And I think that's it. So appreciate your time. I think we went a little bit over. Happy to take questions. I'm here for a while, so yeah.
Thank you, Neil and Catherine. It's just wonderful, a real eye opener, I think, for many of us, and really fascinating topic. We have a few questions. Let's see. Someone asks way back up here, Tanya asks of Neil, do you agree with Dr. James Adavizio that Indigenous people were here 30,000 plus years ago? Evidence of flora and fauna tools found at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania.
I'll only say again how I began the presentation, and that when you go back to Haudenosaunee traditional thinkers and knowledge holders, they always say we've always been here. And that's the only answer I can provide.
Thank you. Thanks also for sharing that link for a basic call to consciousness if people are interested. It's in the chat. Melissa Miskovic Bramble asks, how far do you travel for these sorts of programs? I'm director of operations at the St. Cateri Tekakwitha Shrine in Fonda, Mohawk ancestral land.
You know, we travel. I'm trying to think, you know, some of our funding is like, oh, you can't travel outside the state with this funding. But that's not typically the case. The important thing is that we are requested by the community to travel there. It's not so much of the distance or the location, it's the fact that a community has requested our assistance to conduct a BioBlitz. And then we go from there, right? We're in constant contact with the leadership in the communities and making sure that this is going to benefit their community first and foremost.
Someone asks, let's see, they're moving away from me. Where can we continue to learn traditional planting methods, e.g. the Three Sisters mound approach?
Well, one place I think of right away is Ganondigan. They have a great Ganondigan is south of Rochester and Victor, and have been planting a Three Sisters garden on, you know, in an old Haudenosaunee settlement place actually. So it's a really special reestablishment, a reconnection there. Beyond that, there is some interesting literature. There's actually Cornell produced a pamphlet at one time through their Indian program called Wisdom of the Three Sisters, I believe, and that's been a useful pamphlet and to instruct people on the ways of that sort of polyculture.
Someone mentions that there's a Mother's Day planting at Ganondigan coming up, and the link to that place, that site is there. Someone has added that.
Great.
Thank you. And Catherine adds a couple of times that you should contact her if you're interested in participating in a BioBlitz. Whom should we contact to perhaps explore ways of being more directly involved with land opportunities? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are lots of groups, both land trusts and organizations that have been started by Indigenous people and communities who are working on that very issue. You know, that has taken different that has taken different paths in terms of giving land back, but one of the things that, you know, I think is important is to develop a relationship and, again, some trust with some of these polities, actually, the governing structures that are both within and sometimes outside of the community, to be able to make moves towards that effort, right? So it takes a long time. It's not as if you can just, unfortunately, as if you have a deed today and you say, hey, I need to enact this moment of justice for me and my family and return this land to Indigenous peoples. It's going to take some time to do that. And so, you know, if you have further questions, I'd be happy to sort of point you in the right direction, and of course, understand who your local contacts are is probably the most important piece to that.
Great. David Du Bois asks, what implications do native land uses have on land stewardship that you feel are underappreciated and underimplemented by land managers and stewards?
I'll let Catherine start with that one. That's a great question.
I can certainly start. And hi, David. It's great to have you here. Well, first of all, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is eat venison. I mean, hunt deer hunting, not necessarily limited to a season. There have been studies done that have found that in indigenous communities where venison is an important part of the diet and the deer population is somewhat reduced, that there's a much healthier understory plant communities. So that's one thought. And then also, I think valuing mature and old growth characteristics is really important. And I know land trusts do that and some private landowners do that. The state does not really seem to do that in many cases, in terms not only of state forest land, but also of programs like the 480A program, which basically gives you tax breaks for saw timber almost exclusively. I mean, with very little other values being considered in terms of forest land. So those are a couple thoughts. I don't know if you had anything to add there, Neil.
Yeah, and it's more of a philosophical point, and that is that all of this land is Indian land, right? And that contemporary, let's say, Western or settler land managers and stewards tend to think about this in terms of ownership, right? They tend to think about terms like the public. And those are terms that don't really exist or don't make sense in a native land stewardship MO, right? In the way that we think about land. And so it's a big ask, but, I would think about contemporary contemporary Western land stewards and managers as going back to this idea of resurgence, is to imagine, right? To imagine, to have the courage and imagination to envision life beyond the state. I think that may be one of the most important aspects of breaking out of this us and them sort of model.
Good philosophy. Jason Corwin, hi Jason, says there's a new Indigenous-led organization in the Ithaca area doing projects involving plant medicines, among many other activities. There's a link there if in the chat, if anybody's interested in learning more about that. Lots of things about events coming up. Asking if you've worked with SUNY Cobble Skill Plant Science, or someone else asks about the same neighborhood is why I'm linking the two. If you've worked at all with the Iroquois Museum in Howe Caverns to identify areas in that region of the state, I suppose for the looking for populations of ginger, for instance, or I'm not sure if that's the exact question, but
yeah, we do have some work with the Iroquois Museum, and I'll just mention one of Catherine's pieces that I've learned so much from, and in her work in historical ecology is looking at work by like Nancy Turner out in the West in using museum artifacts as a plan for plant restoration, right? In thinking about, as Catherine mentioned, the number of poles, or let's say the number of splints, let's say the number of strands to produce this material, we can sort of hypothesize the amount of sort of standing biomass that's needed to produce this material culture. And a lot of folks are going to places like Rochester Science Museum, going to places and doing all kinds of interesting analysis, like that pot residue Catherine was talking about, the cooking pot residue, right? And then sort of reconstructing a floral assemblage and saying, yes, we need bulrush in our lives. And how do we encourage bulrush as a plant that's culturally significant to Haudenosaunee on the land today?
Great. Let's see. Oh, someone has asked for your contact information, Neil.
Sure, I can put that in the chat right now. Then.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have certainly lots of expressions of gratitude and appreciation for both of you and this presentation this evening. If there's maybe one more question, yes, the recording will be available in a week or so. There's Neil's email address if anybody's interested. And the chat, I guess the chat will be available too. Is that correct? Can anyone confirm that? Because there are plenty of lots of links and things that people are sharing here that we probably can't get
Yes,
to.
I hope someone is capturing the chat. I would like it.
Yeah, I think we try to do that. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we are going a little long, and even though we could would probably be able to, we could listen to you too for much longer. I think we really want to thank you both for a really thoughtful and inspiring presentation. It's been great to meet you, Neil. Catherine, it's great to see you, and glad to know what you're up to there. And I think that we've got a lot of interested people in the work that you're doing, and I'm sure some of them will be in touch. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.